So tomorrow is Father's Day, and when I think about being a father, I shared this before, but Anita and I we were not planning on having any children. She was a teacher, I was a pastor. We were going to be heavily involved with the children of our church, and so why did we need to have our own family? And we were going to be, helping other people's children. Well, as you know, that didn't happen, which I am very thankful for. But I remember the Friday afternoon, we were cleaning our house, and we thought that something was slightly off, and so Anita had gone to the drugstore and she had gotten the little pregnancy test. Now, having never done one before, we were looking at the results. It's like, and most of you have been through this before, but it's like, is that two lines? Is that just one? That's really, really faint. Well, I'm not sure if I did it right. What do you mean you're not sure if you did it right? Go back to the store and get another one. So she, went to the store and came back, did it again, and here we are. It's almost like a COVID test, just way more exciting. But anyway, so sure enough, the test was positive. She cried. I think it was happy tears. But as a parent, as you're expecting the birth of your child, and you're obviously, you're excited, you're preparing for it and everything, and you're hoping, above all else, that your child will be healthy. And your child is born, and your child grows, and as your child gets older, and as a parent, you're watching every move. The first time that they crawl, the first time they roll over, the first time they sit up, the first time they crawl, the first time they walk. And you're watching, and you're celebrating every development. But as a parent, as you're watching your child grow and develop, and then you start to realize that something seems slightly off. That your child is not developing the same way that the other children are, and they're not being able to talk the way they should, and they're not being able to crawl, or they're not being able to walk the way they should, and you start to wonder, and you start to take them, next thing you know, you're taking them to doctor's offices, and you have doctor's appointments, and you're trying to figure out what is wrong with your child. My older sister, Rachel, had 3 boys. I say had, she only has 2 now. But her second child, they started to notice that something wasn't quite right. And so they took him to the doctor, and the doctor did a bunch of tests, and it came back to the fact that he had cerebral palsy. So she found herself doing exercises with his feet and causing him pain, and he would cry out in pain because of the fact of the exercises that she was having to do. Her firstborn, her oldest son, would tell her, "Stop doing that, Mommy. You're hurting him. Stop doing that." But she knew that she had to do that in order for him to be able to get better. Well, he was able to walk a little bit slower than everybody else, not really able to run like the other children, but he was able to move. That went on for a few years. But then when George, her firstborn son, was 11 years old, he suddenly had difficulty walking. It was painful. It got to be the point where it was so painful for him to walk that they would have to pick him up and carry him. And they couldn't understand what was wrong, so they started going to the doctor's offices again. More hospital visits. What is wrong with George? Come to find out, George had this, and I forgot it now. I had it. Anyway, he had brittle bones. So the reason why he wasn't able to walk is his leg was already broken in 3 places. They never knew. He didn't fall. It wasn't like he had had an accident or whatever, but just over the course of time, he had broken his leg. So they had to go in and they had to install a metal rod in his leg so that he'd be able to walk. You never expect that these kind of things will happen to your children. Other people, yes, but not to yours. They assumed that as George grew older that he would have to have more surgeries to replace, bones grow, metal doesn't. And so they figured that they would have to go in for additional surgeries. But despite all of that, it wasn't the cerebral palsy or the disease that George had. As many of you know, since we have been here, George died in a tragic swimming accident while he was working at summer camp, and he drowned. But when you think about, as a parent, looking at your children, more than anything, you want your children to be healthy. But when you look at the physical ailments that children might encounter, what is worse than having a physical problem or a physical issue is for your child to have a spiritual issue. Somebody recently asked me, they said, if you could think about everything that you would need over the next year, what are your 3 greatest needs? Think about that. What are your 3 greatest needs? So I did. And as I thought about it, I thought, you know what? Over anything else, what are the things that I need the most? And so they came back and they said, well, have you thought about it? And I said, yeah, I did. And I said, I realize that this is not what you're asking. But my greatest need is for me to know God, for Anita to know God, and for our children to know God. Those are my 3 greatest needs. But imagine as a parent when you realize that your child not only has a physical issue, but has a spiritual issue as well. I invite you to open your Bibles to Mark chapter 9. Mark chapter 9, and we're starting at verse 14. Mark chapter 9, verse 14. Okay, Mark chapter 9, verse 14. The context of this story is Jesus, Peter, James, and John had just been on top of the mountain spending the night in prayer, and we have the story of the transfiguration, right? So they're coming down off of the mountain after spending that night in prayer. It's verse 14. When they came to the other disciples, they saw a large crowd around them and the teachers of the law arguing with them. As soon as all the people saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with wonder and ran to greet him. Verse 16, what are you arguing with them about? He asked. A man in the crowd answered, Teacher, I brought you my son who is possessed by a spirit and has robbed him of speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not. I want to stop here just for a minute to imagine, we've all heard this story before, but imagine here is a father with his son who is in serious trouble. We'll read in just a few minutes the fact that not only did the boy not be able to speak, but the fact that the spirit that was possessing him would throw him into the fire and into the water, trying to destroy him. Imagine if you're a parent and your child is possessed with a demon, and it's very clear that that demon, his one goal is to destroy your child. How would you feel? And this parent, this father, taking his son, had done everything he possibly could to save his child. And everything that he had done, nothing was solving his problem. But he had heard stories. He had heard stories about a man named Jesus who had performed miracles for other people. And so this father said, the thing that I need to do is I need to take my son and I need to find this man named Jesus, because surely if the stories are true, he can help my son. But the problem is when he gets there, when he brings his son to the disciples, were the disciples able to help his son? No. Now imagine, had the disciples been given power to cast out demons? Yes. Had they cast out demons before? Yes. So you can imagine when this father brings his son to the disciples and he says, here is my son who is possessed by a demon. Can you do something for him? And what do the disciples say? Absolutely. Stand back. Just watch. Watch what I'm going to do. Demon, come out. Nothing happens, right? Let me try again. Come out, demon. Nothing happens. Demon, go away. Nothing, right? And then another disciple, here, let me try. Through all the other 9 disciples, they're all trying to cast out the demon, and nothing happens. And since nothing happens, what takes place? An argument. An argument starts happening between the disciples and the scribes and the Pharisees. Imagine if you're a father. You're bringing your son, and the other gospels say that it was his only son. You're bringing your only son for a miracle, for healing. Nothing happens, and then all of a sudden, the crowd that is around starts having a theological debate. How many times do we come to church wanting to have a personal encounter with Jesus, and instead all we find is people arguing about theology? I'm wanting a miracle. I'm wanting a personal encounter with God, and you guys are arguing amongst yourselves. How do you think that made the Father feel? Where is Jesus? Where is Jesus when I need him? I'm not interested in the argument. I just want a miracle for my child. Have you ever been there? Have you ever felt that way? Verse 19, Jesus' response. He says, "O unbelieving generation," Jesus replied, "how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy to me." So they brought him. When the spirit saw Jesus, it immediately threw the boy into a convulsion. He fell to the ground and rolled around, foaming at the mouth. Jesus asked the boy's father, "How long has he been like this?" "From childhood," he answered. "It has often thrown him into the fire or water to kill him." Now just imagine, if you're the parent, some of you have been caregivers. When you're watching over somebody else, you know the mental and physical exhaustion of having to watch somebody 24/7, worried that if you just shut your eyes just for a few minutes, you're worried about what will happen to your loved one. Have you been there? And this father says, I cannot do anything. This is consuming my entire life because, my boy, my child, is being thrown into the fire, into the water. I cannot leave him for a second because of what this demon is doing to him. Continuing on in verse 22, the father says, he says, it has often thrown him into the fire or water to kill him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us. Do you hear it? What does the father say? If you can do anything. The father has brought his son to Jesus to be healed because of the stories that he has heard. But the disciples weren't able to do anything, and so the father is starting to give up hope. And so in talking to Jesus, he says, if you can do anything, please help us. How many of you have ever wondered if the miracles that you hear about are only for other people, but they never apply to yourself? Have you ever wondered that miracles don't happen anymore today? It's kind of like Gideon, right? Whatever happened to the good old days when God was evident? I mean, here he is talking to God, and Gideon says, what happened to the old, good old days when miracles happen? And this father comes to Jesus and he says, I've heard about all these stories, about all the miracles that you do, but does it not apply to me? Does it not apply to my son? Where's my miracle? Where's my answer to my prayer? He says, if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us. What is Jesus' response in verse 23? If you can, said Jesus, everything is possible for him who believes. Immediately, the boy's father exclaimed, I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief. The plea of the father says, Lord, I believe. If there's any part of me that doesn't believe, help me. I am so totally dependent upon you. Please help me. You are my last hope, my last resort. Please help me. Please perform the miracle for my boy. Forgive me for my unbelief. When Jesus saw that a crowd was running to the scene, he rebuked the evil spirit. You deaf and mute spirit, he said, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again. The spirit shrieked, convulsed him violently, and came out. The boy looked so much like a corpse that many said, he's dead. But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him to his feet, and he stood up. How many of you, as you have come to church today, how many of you feel like the Father, where he says, you know what, I believe, that's why I'm here. But yet, even in my belief, there are times in my life where I don't sense your presence. I don't sense the miracle for my life. Don't raise your hand. But the thing is, I am sure that as we look back in our life, whether we are not there today, I'm sure all of us can look back at a period in our life where we have questioned, where we have doubted the power of God for our life. We don't feel it, we don't sense it, and we're like the Father saying, you know what? I believe, but yet I want to see it, I want to experience it for myself. Just a little bit earlier when the disciples were up on the mountaintop, what did Peter say? He said, Lord, it is good for us to be here. Let's stay on top of the mountain all the time, right? It's powerful to see Elijah and Moses and see Jesus glorified. Let's stay up here where we feel it, where we see it. Let's not come off of the mountain down to the valley in the darkness, in the despair of life. It's nice to be on the mountaintop, isn't it? It's not fun to be down in the valley. But you know what? Sometimes we learn more about God down in the valley when we have to go by faith and we have to go by trust. Just recently, once a month, the area pastors, we get together for devotion and prayer, and we go out to eat. And when we gathered together, Pastor Barry Taylor from Albany, he was sharing how he had done worship at Central Valley. And he talked about the sunflower. And you know how the sunflower, how it always faces the sun. Over the course of the day, the sunflower will follow the sun. But he said something that I had never heard before. And he said, did you realize that the sunflower, not only does it follow the sun during the day, but it also follows the sun at night? Because in the morning, where is the sunflower facing? In the east. Well, how does it get facing the east if it's not continually following the sun? So not only during the day, but also during the night, that sunflower is constantly turning to face the sun. So that when the sun does appear, when it feels that warmth, the sunflower is prepared and faced toward the sun. So my question for you today is, do we face the sun only when it is shining, when we feel the warmth of God's presence? Or do we also continue to follow the sun in the periods of life where it seems dark and drear and we don't see the miracles? Do we continue to follow the sun? When you think about the Father looking for a miracle, coming to Jesus with his only child, saying, I want to see the miracle. And he says, if you can do anything. And Jesus' response, he says, if, and the Father says, I'm sorry, I believe. Please forgive me of where my periods of doubt. Please help my unbelief. As we are here today, claiming to follow Jesus, do we believe God all the time? Or do we believe that the promises of God are only for us when we see the miracles? How many times through Scripture did the Jews and whatever say, show us the sign and we'll believe? Do we believe even in the times of darkness?